Welcome everybody to the Harbor Bible Study. This is week 5 of season 2, and tonight we're going to cover a couple of chapters. So last week in week 4, we covered Genesis 12. And Genesis 12 being that big moment where we switch from all the early stuff that talks about how the world came to be and how we had our first family, and we transitioned into Abraham at the end of Genesis 11, at that point called Abram instead of Abraham. Genesis 12, Abram takes front and center stage, and he will maintain that kind of position in our narrative for about 12 chapters. And so we are now in the story of Abram and his family. And last week signaled that change. It was not only a change in kind of perspective, like going from the whole world to one man and his family, but also a change in the narrative style. And if you were reading Genesis 12, especially coming out of Genesis 1 to 11, you can almost feel the difference, the way it just subtly shifts from these vague, large, grand statements, characters that tend to be fairly flat, to we start to get a little bit more robust picture of humanity. Abram is not kind of a simple character. He has layers, and we started to see that at the end of Genesis 12, where they go down to Egypt, and he kind of makes this, I don't know what you want to call it, like some of the rabbis called it a sin, where he said that Sarai is not my wife, she's my sister, and we're gonna kind of use that fact to get out of what might be a tricky situation. So no longer do we have kind of just characters who are simple and only have like one psychological motivation. We have a little more robust characterization. So that was last week. And now this week, we're covering Genesis 13, 14, and if time, we'll get into 15, 13, 14, and 15. And so there's a lot to do here. And we're just going to jump in. So we all good with that? All right. Would somebody be willing to go ahead and read Genesis 13 for us? It's about, what is it, 20 verses? Not quite, like 18? 18.
Sure.
Yes, thank you.
So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him to the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. He journeyed on by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been in the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them living together, for their possessions were so great that they could not live together. And there was strife between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the plain, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's very good. The Oaks of Mamre, that's a fairly well-known phrase, right? Interesting about Mamre is we actually don't know where that word comes from. It does not seem to be Proto-Semitic. So we don't have a good guess of what that means. So let's jump back to the beginning of this. What we have in this chapter is largely a couple of things. One, we get the return of Abram and his entire retinue coming back into Canaan. That's part one. Along with it, they kind of mention his wealth and everything that he has. Whether it's implied that some of this or some of this comes from Pharaoh, it doesn't really say, but like that's what the previous chapter said, is he got some from, he had some before he went to Egypt, and he got some more while in Egypt. So that's the first part, is the return from Egypt back to Canaan. The second thing is this notion of the quarreling between Lot and Abram and their peoples, and the separation of the two people and all the implications about that. And then the third part is the reaffirmation of the promise. So those are the three big moves that happen in this chapter. So let me go ahead and share the screen so that you can see. All right, I am hopeful you can see this. So Egypt is, well, if you can see the cursor, Egypt is down here to the southwest of this map. It doesn't show Egypt. Okay, but as Abraham or Abram at this point would return into the land, they would come up through here, probably close to the coast, through Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, something like that. That would be a likely way to return from Egypt back into the land if there's no particular reason you're having to not go that way, right? That kind of coastal road would be the safest way. So they get back there and they get to this region right here, which is Bethel. And it says they were in between Bethel and Ai. So this is very centrally located in Canaan. This is also, you should note, you see these triangles that kind of run north to south? That would really kind of continue a little bit further. I think they didn't put that symbol because it's a somewhat crowded map, but that really does run all the way from, you know, up, actually maybe as, well, certainly north of Mount Tabor, but all the way down through Jerusalem down to about Hebron. So there's a lot of mountains, but this area that Abraham is hanging out in, that's very much hill country. So that's where they're hanging out when they return. And you note that when they return to this place, the first thing they do is they hang out in a place where he has previously built an altar. So he built the altar, went down to Egypt. When he comes back, he returns to that altar spot because he wants to worship the Lord at that space. The text is silent about the reason why, but it's this reminder that Abraham is not using other worship sites. He's not using Canaanite sites. He is only using sites that he builds or returns to. And this is to kind of emphasize that he and his family are the patriarchs, as we call them, right, of a new religion. Or not necessarily a new religion, right? Because there had not been some sort of formal worship of Yahweh that we see prior to this. It's much more ad hoc, much more family. this seems to mark the transition into something that people point back to and say, we are related to that guy. That's part of our religion. Let's see. We also know by the time we get to about verse 7, this is this transition as we move into the quarrel between the two. It says, now the Canaanite and the Perizzite, while it's in the singular, it's not singular. They're kind of trying to suggest the people groups, right? The Canaanites is how we would say it in English, and the Perizzites were then dwelling in the land. Okay, so we have strife. Like this word strife in Hebrew is riv, and this is often used of lawsuits, but that it would probably be far too much to suggest that there's anything kind of legal going on here. It's just a reminder that lawsuits originate in this notion of people contending against one another, right? So that's what's going on here. So do you notice anything about this? Like, I feel like maybe I'm just fishing for you to guess what's in my mind, right? Yeah, a little bit. They've gone to great lengths to talk about how much Abraham has, and then they re-emphasize that Lot also has a lot of stuff. And now they're in this hill country, which might not be quite as good as the coastal plains for farming or for even grazing your flocks. And they're starting to come into competition because there's not enough for all the stuff that they have. But in verse 7, where it first talks about that conflict, it also notes that the Canaanites and Perizzites are there, meaning there's more people than just Abraham and Lot that are kind of competing for this land, right? Now, as some people have noted, Victor Hamilton says, isn't it interesting that somehow Abram, as we move on through this chapter, is able to coexist with the Canaanites and the Perizzites after Lot leaves, but could not coexist with his own family? Or maybe reverse that. Lot was unable to coexist with Abraham. They were fighting with one another. I don't know that I want to make too much of that, but it's certainly the idea that there's a scarcity of resources for the flock, and so they have to separate in order to maintain peace, right? This also might reflect a different way in which Abraham is engaging a situation. So when there was a challenge beforehand, challenge to Abram's livelihood, the first thing he does is concocts a narrative to manipulate the situation and say, don't tell them you're my wife, tell them you're my sister, and then maybe we can kind of get through this thing. But here, as the conflict is just beginning to arise, Abram goes to Lot and says, hey, let's talk about this. It's also, another notion here is that instead of perhaps maybe a greed-influenced way of trying to get through that first situation, as in Egypt, here it's more like, you know what, I'm going to be the bigger person in this case, right? You get to choose first how we're going to split. So we should probably go in different directions. That's probably best. But you get to go first. You make your choice, and whatever you choose, that's fine. I'll go the other way. And so we see kind of this different side of Abram where he is making peace kind of proactively in order to avoid problem. Now, whether this is Abram who has grown because of the lessons he experienced in Egypt, or whether this is just another facet of his personality that he wants to avoid conflict with his own family, it's not clear. But this is the scenario we see. So he says to Lot, you choose. You go left, I'll go right. You want the right, I'll go left. What do we want here? And it's the reminder, have I explained this before? Left and right would not be, as we would conceptualize it, left being west and right being east, right? Because when we think of like what's our left, we're probably thinking north is like ahead of us or up. So if north is up, left is west, right? But they did not orient themselves in space in that way. So what was in front of them was the rising sun. So that would be east is in front of them. So left would be to go north, and right would be to go south. So what Abram is doing here is offering Lot the opportunity to go north or to go south. And let's see. So what does he choose? He sees the valley of the Jordan. So where's the valley of the Jordan? Let's go back to our map. Okay. If they are right here in Bethel, if they're right here in Bethel I, like going left would be north, would be towards Shechem and Gilboa and Jezreel and all this, right? And going right would be going south to Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Hebron. And where does Lot choose to go?
Isn't it south in Sodom and Gomorrah down by the bottom of the Dead Sea?
I believe it's thought to be actually at the top of the Red Sea.
Oh,
the
okay.
Dead Sea,
Okay.
right? So instead of going left or right, he goes east.
I thought it was a trick question. I was going to say east, but I was like, I have to be wrong.
No, right? I mean, that's right. I mean, in fact, this is exactly what it says. Verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward, and thus they separated from each other. So I don't know that that's a big deal, but it's like these are the kind of things that are good to pay attention to in the text. Now, the text is foreshadowing for us bad things are coming, right? This is the place where Sodom and Gomorrah is. He's choosing this place. Watch out, dear reader. But the way it's framed in this chapter, there's really no reason that Lot should be worried about that. I mean, he just sees like a valley, a well-watered valley of the Jordan, and that's a reasonable place to want to take your flocks. So he chooses that and goes in that direction. But it is interesting. I don't know. And I actually haven't seen anyone talk about this notion of Lot going east as opposed to north or south. But there might be this sense in which Lot didn't he both took what Abram offered him and kind of still tweaked it to his own wants and needs. Right? So there is this tradition then that because he went towards the Jordan River, that this is outside the realm of Canaan. There's a long tradition of interpreting this as Lot going outside of Canaan. And why is that? When you look at verse 12, it said, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled elsewhere, right? Settled in the cities of the valley. So what this might be doing is kind of saying, look, Lot had the opportunity to be the heir of Abraham, but he made a choice not to settle in Canaan, which was the land that was promised to him by God. He chose, in fact, to settle elsewhere. And this, dear reader, is why he was there, thus ineligible to be the heir of Abram. Now, when I first was reading one of the commentaries that said this, I felt like maybe that's an overreach, but I started to see it in a couple of places. And so I thought maybe, I mean, especially if this has a long tradition of understanding that verse 11 and 12 in that way, maybe it's got some merit that I didn't see upon my first reading. Apparently in verse 14 and 15, this kind of gets undone a little bit. I don't know. Okay. Verse 13 throws one of those quick foreshadowing things again. Sodom, they were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. back to our story. So now we move on from all of the separation to the reaffirmation of the promise. Abram is spoken to by the Lord, and he says, basically, look around, and everywhere you can see, that's going to be both yours and your descendants. So look northward, southward, eastward, westward, and all the land that you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. Now, apparently back in verse 12, it really only said to your descendants. So it feels like it's expanding the promise, suggesting that Abram's going to get to enjoy some of this. And it starts with this notion of saying, I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth. That doesn't feel like a very promising promise. I mean, I think the idea is numerous, right? Like the dust, you can't count it. But that's not quite as poetic as the next promise we see later on. So verse 17, arise, walk the length of the land, and I will give it to you. And this seems to reflect what's going to happen when we get back to Joshua in a couple of books. When they come into the land and it says kind of everywhere you go, that's going to be yours. So this is that kind of foreshadowing of how the land how they get the claim on the land. All right. And then this chapter really ends. One last time sharing the screen. Down here at Hebron. So he's up here in Bethel. Lot goes over here towards Jericho, Sodom, and Abram goes down to Hebron. And when we get to the wilderness of Zin and wilderness of Edom, this whole region is known as the Negev. It's the deserty area. And that would be one of the places where he would have attended to his flocks. So that's chapter 13. Any thoughts, questions, comments, snide remarks? So it's somebody like to think about the larger picture here and see if you can kind of place this in the larger picture of what's going on. Starting with chapter 12, what happens here in chapter 13, and then any sort of like generalized idea of where it's going. Like what is chapter 13 doing is my main question.
My assumption is that it's kind of giving us a feel for them settling, essentially, this idea of land claiming of some sort. I don't know how nomadic, everybody was before, but just this idea that we're going to settle down and the promise essentially starting to be fulfilled as you claim territory.
Yeah, that's good. Right. So 12, he's received the promise, slight detour into Egypt. He comes back, and so now we're going to fulfill this. And settle down is good as long as we contextualize it to this idea that as they were pastoralists, they never were terribly rooted, but settling down in the sense of they were like narrowing the scope of where they would go, right? So we're going to hang out primarily in Canaan, or at least our home base is primarily in Canaan. And we will wander, we will take our flocks into the Negev, throughout the hill country. If it's safe, we'll take them to the plains or the valley of the Jordan. And as necessary, maybe even back into Egypt. But we are settling in this general vicinity, and we are fulfilling that promise. And then the other narrative move is to remind us that Lot is not going to be the heir. So
there's a reason for that. Because I was going to say, and it feels like there's establishing a reason for that given the choice, do you want A or B? And he says, I'll take C, I'll take D. In fact, let me take a little bit of A and B and I'll get the better of the two, and comes up with his own ideas of let me take the greener pasture. I'll take the greater water. You stay up in the rocky area where it's harder to raise the flocks. I mean, there's not a sense of evenness in his heart.
Mm. That is a common way of interpreting that from the rabbis on, is that, yeah, Lot's heart did not look for equity between he and Abram, and that's part of what put him in danger, right? He chose that place that everybody wants in the Valley of the Jordan, and therefore, he's not going to be safe. But ultimately, again, the rabbis were suggesting it's a heart issue, not just a resource issue, right? Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Because we read later kind of what an altar might look like, but what would an altar look like at this time that it would have still remained after having traveled to Egypt and back? What would have been the identifiable markers, or do they just know the land better than we do, that they would have been like, oh, I made a tent here before? And
they would definitely know the land better. Let me see. There's a really good altar at Beersheba. Let's see if I can get a picture of it. Here's a good picture of it. Oh, come on. No. Back. Here we go. Okay. So this is at Beersheba. This is not the one in between Bethel and Ai, but this is a good representation of it. You see a little girl here over in the back of this picture. It might be really tiny for you, but my guess is this little girl would come up maybe just to the top of this, meaning this is a fairly substantial altar. It's probably packed with dirt, and then the bricks get placed around it, so that's not necessarily brick all the way through, although there would be altars that would be brick all the way through. Some altars might even be a single slab of stone, but in this case, this has what are known as the horns of the altar. So this has 4 horns, and of course that's abstract for what a horn would look like, but there is another one, and for some reason the name of the place has just fled my mind. I'll think of it probably right after this video ends, right? But it was brown or brownish blackish for all the blood that had seeped into the altar from all the sacrifices that had been made on it. So this one, it is not that color, and I don't know that I know offhand why it's not that color, but it is a great representation of what an altar would look like. Now, altars would also tend to be...
it says in the description that it was a replica.
Yes.
So that's why there's not blood on it.
Sorry, say again? Oh,
that's probably why there's not blood on it. Okay,
got it. There is... Perhaps this replica is because they found so many of the pieces as well, that's how they knew how to make a replica look like this. Thank you for that clarifying point. I had forgotten that. Where is it? I really want to remember the name of the other site because it's so great. It's such a good site. And I've seen it in person. But in any case, they would often be raised up over the local area or in the hills. So, I mean, that kind of starts you along the path of to know where to look. But it's also, they would know the land better. So they would start heading towards the hills. And if there's maybe a specific spot that was raised above others, even if just by a little bit, they would know to kind of gravitate to those spaces. Yeah. Oh, man, now it's eating at me. I really want to remember this. I'm going to take 1 second. Telerod. I think it's Telerod. Got it. All right, let's see.
Senility has not sunken in yet.
Not quite. It's trying though. It's trying. Oh, I can't find a good picture quickly. I'll have it by the end of this. Right? We'll do it later because the picture I found is not great. All right. So there we go. That's chapter 13. And so it's not like exciting, but it is this reminder that like this story has a point and it's moving somewhere. So, all right, let's move into chapter 14. And unlike chapter 13, we're not going to read through it all. And part of that is because verses 1 to 11 are fairly dry list of names. I mean, there's a little bit more to it. So what I'm going to do is give you about 30 seconds. I want you to skim those 11 verses on your own really quickly. Go ahead and read actually verse 12 as well, or skim it. All right, so in broad sweeping terms, what is happening in chapter 14? You've encountered the first half right here. And basically, there is an invasion of an alliance of kings from the east. Lots of names, lots of places, and they start to work together to come in because they've got a problem with the king of Sodom. Now, because Lot is living near there, he's collateral damage. So they take him and his stuff. Not great. But it doesn't seem to be that he was the target or anything. It's just, look, if this land is so obviously good that Lot goes, I want to go water my flocks there, then clearly somebody else is going to look at it and go, well, I want that too. And so if they can go and take it, well, the rule in ancient warfare is basically if you're strong enough, go get it. So here come these people from the east. They've got a problem with the king of Sodom, probably because he's got good land. And they take all their stuff and they take Lot. Now, the second half is Abram going and getting Lot and then kind of returning and meeting a couple of interesting people. So overarching ideas about this chapter is that, one, this is a truly international chapter, kind of interesting for this early in the book, because to this point we really have only had the etiologies of how like the world came to be and then Abram, but now all of a sudden we've got this rich and varied world that seems to exist that we had no window into until this moment. And from the very first moment we see them, we get warfare. As E.A. Spicer said, who wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on Genesis, this is international and impersonal. And he also says that this is unusual style and vocabulary, which really suggests that this is kind of a different thing than almost anything else we see in Genesis. And for those who are aware of the documentary hypothesis, whether things are written from the J source, E source, P source, or D source, for those who kind of find that that has some explanatory power, this is one chapter that most people say is not from any of those sources. It's sometimes even ascribed to what's known as an X source. Now that's from Spicer, who was writing about 60 years ago. So things may have developed on this like source idea since then. But for the most part, like the thing to take away from this is simply that it's very different from everything else in Genesis. We have no extra biblical material that kind of confirms this event or explains it. So that's interesting, right? Like a lot of things in the Bible, we don't get confirmation by something else, by some other text from another power. This is one of those events. We just don't have it. And as we've mentioned, Lot's choice put him unwittingly in harm's way, and now he's kind of dependent, even though he just kind of spurned Abram in the way he made the choice. Abram says, do you want A or B? And he goes, I want C. Well, now he's got to rely upon Abram to secure his safety. The other thing I would note is, for the most part, all the people mentioned in verses 1 through 11 are not truly identifiable. There is some speculation about who some of these people are, but it remains speculation at best. By and large, we might be able to identify one or two, but like it really is not clear who these people are. And so this is one suggestion that either this is a very old text where things might be going by different names or different like titles and things like that. I see the question from Chris about what about place names. There are some of these have place names that we can kind of deal with. But again, some of them are just too vague to really be helpful, like regions as opposed to specific cities. Yeah. For instance, in verse 1, we get Shinar, which is mentioned in Genesis 10 as a region of 3 cities, 3 places. It says Arioch, the king of Elasar. Nobody quite knows what to do with that, and they think it might be like a corruption of an Akkadian place name. What was it? I don't have it in front of me. All Akar or something like this, perhaps. And so it's a corruption of it as opposed to the actual place name. The problem is with almost every place and person listed, there is something that makes us say, this is not quite what we expect. So this is either very old or it's just been corrupted through transmission. So it's a little hard to kind of pin this down historically. I want to make sure I just get, yeah, that's the only comment so far. It says something in verse 3, for instance. It says, and these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. Some people have interpreted that as the valley of Siddim is where the Salt Sea came to be, but that doesn't seem to work because we know archaeologically that, or geologically, that the Dead Sea has been there since about 12,000 BCE. So that would seem to suggest maybe they meant the region south of the Dead Sea or something like that. Again, all of this is unclear and vague, and we really can't pin it down. And so, unfortunately, hey, that's the first half of Genesis 14. But let's jump into the second half. And I'll go ahead and read that out loud. Then a fugitive came and told Abram, the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner. And these were allies with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods, and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. So let's stop there. Yeah. So interesting that Abram is known as the Hebrew, right? Let's see. He is Ha-Ivri. This is not a term that is used very often, or I think this might be the only time it's used before the Israelites go into the Exodus. I'd have to check that out, but it's certainly not common. We don't exactly know what Ivri, meaning translated into English as Hebrew, we don't really know what it means. We don't have a good sense. There's a lot of debate about what it means. Maybe they were people who were set apart. And I don't mean theologically, I mean like physically. And so it might have been a name somehow given to them that they kind of took upon themselves. Similarly to the idea that the British called Americans Yankees as a derogatory term, and Americans kind of went, you want to call us Yankees? Fine, we'll own it, right? So there's that. Ironically, there's a story about this idea of being called a derogatory name that pertains to Tottenham. And I'm looking at myself on the Zoom camera and realized that that's a similar thing that happened there. Long story short, there are a lot of Jewish fans of the Tottenham football team, and a lot of other teams started to make derogatory comments towards the Jewish fans of Tottenham and started calling them Yids, which for the American Jewish community, if I understand correctly, is not particularly derogative, but to the UK Jewish community, it's a derogatory term. But the Tottenham fans said, look, if you make fun of one of us, you make fun of all of us, like we stand together. So Tottenham fans for a very long time have been known as the Yid Army, because they're like, right, you want to call us that? Fine, we accept that term, and we will all be like, if one of us is Jewish, we're all Jewish. And so that's kind of an interesting idea of allyship. Now, it's a very complicated thing, and I'm not trying to speak for everybody, but or like how to interpret that. But it is a notion of how people can cast a name upon you, and instead of it being considered derogatory, they just accept it upon themselves in that way. Maybe an analogy. I don't know. Let's see. Abram takes a bunch of warriors with him, mainly from his house, and it says a very specific number, 318. And this is interesting because 318 lends this air of factuality or like accuracy, but in fact, 318 may just be a way of saying a big number. And why would we say this? Well, we have precedent from both Egypt and a place called Mitanni, where 318 seems to just mean lots of people. It happens over and over. So maybe it was 318 specifically, or maybe it was just like Abraham had a lot of people going with him to fight this battle. He wins the battle by nighttime tactics, so that's interesting. And it seems that he has gone as far as Damascus, which is up in Syria, to go get Lot back. That's a long way if it's not clear, because you remember when Abram was in Haran, that's pretty close to Damascus. So in some ways, he's gone almost all the way back to where he came from. All right, that's that section. Let's jump into the final section, which is interesting for chapter 14. Starting with verse 17. Then after his return from the defeat of how would we say this? Laomer, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and now he was a priest of God Most High. And now we have a poem, right? He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He gave him a tenth of all." The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give the people to me and take the goods for yourself." And Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or sandal thong of anything that is yours, for fear that you would say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, and let them take their share." So, as Abram is returning from the battle, he encounters the king of Sodom and Melchizedek, which is how we say that in English. That's quite a famous name. Do any of you recognize that from anywhere else? It's in the New Testament.
Like in the Bible?
Yeah, like in the Bible.
Okay. Like in Hebrews?
Yeah, it's in Hebrews. I want to say it's chapter 11.
13, maybe?
Is it 13? Well, actually, it's in a couple of chapters. So chapter 6 and chapter 7. Chapter 5, 6, and 7. Right?
5, 6, 7. Cool.
All right, 7 verse 11 is what I think I was thinking of. Okay. And so it kind of makes this comparison, and it uses Melchizedek as an exemplar of righteousness. And according to tradition, he is one of these early examples of monotheism, like true monotheism, worshiping only God Most High. Now, that's a very specific phrase, right? That is El Elyon. And that's a phrase that gets attributed to kind of like an early understanding of like a creator God. And that's not the earliest way people understood Yahweh, but that is an early understanding of the God El, right? Which later they come to understand that El and Yahweh are the same thing, but not at the very first. So El Elyon is the God that is come to understand later as, you know, the right God, right? And Melchizedek is a practitioner of monotheistic worship of El Elyon. And that's one of the reasons why he becomes a righteous priest that people look back to, even though all we really have is this Genesis 14 passage where he comes out, recognizes something good about Abram, and says, God kind of blesses you, and now you need to tithe on that. And he's done good things for you, and, you know, like, keep worshiping him, right? So,
and he
Abram,
writes a song.
I'm sorry, say again?
And he writes a song.
Right, this song in verse 19 and 20?
Yes.
Yeah.
The poetry. Mm-hmm.
Right. Blessed be Abram of God Most High, of El Elyon, possessor of heaven and earth, which is a really interesting title that doesn't get repeated. Like, it's only used here in Genesis 14, so far as I know. That's not a typical epithet of God. And so here's this famous character, and this is really all we get. And he's mentioned again in Hebrews, but somehow he remained in the tradition as an early monotheist of God. Now, he says, give me the people and take the goods for yourself. And Abram says, I'm not going to do that because I don't want anybody to say, you made me rich. I did it myself, basically, or God did it for me, not you. But he uses this great phrase in verse 23. I will not take a thread or a sandal thong of anything that is yours. And that's a weird little phrase. Have you heard me use the term merism before? MERISM. I'll just merism. So this is the idea that you name two things, and you're not just saying those two things. You're saying kind of those two things are the ends of the spectrum, but everything in between those two things. So the very first verse of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's not just suggesting that God created heavens and earth and that's it, but rather God created the heavens, which represents one end of the spectrum, and the earth, which is another end, but implied is everything in between. That's merism. A little bit like when we say like black and white, or like when you give some sort of range of something and you're saying like everything in between. From
Alpha and omega.
Yeah, alpha and omega, from tip to top, A to Z, I see. That's good. Right? Top to toe, tip top to tippy toes, or what? I don't know, whatever. Anyway, it means everything in between. And so this is this idea of the thin thread of a sandal to the thick thread of the sandal. Everything that would incorporate the sandal, that's a merism. So you didn't give me anything. So that's it. That's his encounter with Melchizedek. He seems to be the king of Salem, which everyone agrees is undoubtedly Jerusalem. And I think that's it. Any thoughts or questions about Genesis 14?
So when you were mentioning the fact about El Elyon and just this worship of what they would have known to be Yahweh at a later time. My assumption is that we are writing at a later time, so those writing are aware that that's what they're doing. Are they giving some form of theology, or are they just trying to be are they putting some type of respect towards the history? Although historicity hasn't been that important in any of these stories, are they just saying like, well, because we're talking about an ancient time, we're going to use an ancient name? Or is there something more going on there that they would, in fact, ascribe Elyon to Melchizedek? Something like that.
I'm thinking about your question. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Just considering that, I'm assuming, just like, we kind of read in like the Genesis 11 and 12, that it was probably written later, somewhere, in this exile period of, some sort or whatever. I'm assuming that at the time that the people who were writing were aware. And like you said, even the source might be someone who's not the like Elohist or the Yahwist or something, so maybe there's a different understanding of who the God is, but just kind of wondering like, is the person aware that they're doing this and intentionally writing in Elyon instead of Yahweh? Like, do they worship Yahweh?
So no, I think they're saying perhaps that Melchizedek is like a worshiper of the true God, but he knew them he knew God by this name, El Elyon. Right? I don't think they're doing anything anachronistic there. I think what they're saying is this is the name by which Melchizedek worshipped God. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. And I think just as we're looking at, names of places, but some of those places, like we have Salem, but most likely Jerusalem, it seems like they're trying to, give it to us as it was, in that time frame, which, you know, I don't know if that's always the case. You know, we have Bethel, which maybe isn't Bethel yet, or, you know, like we have a list of things. And so just, I'm not sure again how to read it. Am I reading something that's late and something that's, you know, talking about something a long time ago, as if, you know, we are aware of it in the present. You know, we talk about what's going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah, so we obviously know, like, they're giving spoilers out and that kind of a thing. So just wondering how much that would have been in their minds.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because they gave the spoilers in chapter 13, but I don't think I'm seeing them here in chapter 14. I'm under the impression,
Sure,
if I remember correctly, that 14 might be a slightly older chapter, a slightly older narrative that somehow got worked in this space. But there is some definite continuity between 13, 14, and 15. 14 is not out of the blue. It works narratively, and it also works geographically. Like where Abraham starts is where he ends in chapter 13, which might be, again, part of why they put it there. But it may be an earlier strata of writing. But it's hard to say, right? Because I'm not entirely sure why it's Salem versus Jerusalem, although everyone agrees that Salem refers to Jerusalem. Because in general, I cannot think of a mechanism where the names of cities get longer, but I can think of the mechanism where they get shorter. And Salem as a shorthanding of Jerusalem is a thing that would happen. I don't have the examples off the top of my head. They're in one of those books up there, right? But yeah. So
one of the notes in my study Bible talks about how that Salem is, like, this passage is kind of giving reference to Jerusalem being such a holy city, because like through Melchizedek. And so it's like that's part and we see that in other places where they like kind of explain like origins or references to. And so like this is this writer saying that they are doing that with Jerusalem and saying like, hey, here's a note of like, this is a holy place.
That's a good point. Yeah, because this ends up being the, you know, the center of David's kingdom, right? And it's nice that Jerusalem really kind of ticks all the boxes for why it becomes a great capital for David and Solomon, and then the Judahites later, right? One, it's originally independent of Israel and Judah. So that's one. But two, it has this history as a holy place with Melchizedek being the king / priest of that city. And it's got a lot of natural defenses, and it's in the right area for international trade, or at least it's not as bad as a lot of other Israelite cities. So it kind of works very well for their purposes. But being a religious site from antiquity, or at least perceived to have been, is definitely one of those. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Any other thoughts about Genesis 14?
Can you talk about the relationship between like that's an interesting like king priest role in doing both, whereas like later on, especially as we get into like the kingdom of Israel and then this split and such, like that role is like divided. Like there's the religious leaders, and then there's the king role. I mean, I guess we have Egypt too, who kind of combines that. Is that it? How many of them in this time period, like, do they split versus keep them together? Like, was that really unique to Israel?
No. I think you see the king priest thing kind of south, like towards Egypt. and you tend to see a division between king and priest in the ancient Near East, like in Mesopotamia. So kings in Mesopotamia did not tend to be priests as well, but it was a very important aspect of them to support the religious establishment, and they'd make a big deal about, I supported the gods, I supported the infrastructure of the gods. So that's I kind of feel like I wonder if Melchizedek being king priest has something to do with an influence like from the southwest, like Egypt. In the 16th through 14th century BCE, Egypt had a fairly heavy influence on Canaan. And so I wonder if that has anything to do with it. That the conceptualizing of leadership was influenced by Egypt in Canaan because, Egypt was dominant politically. And so, the big guy on the block has a king priest. We should too. I don't know. But yeah, as a general thing, the Semitic influences, I don't think it's combined very often. Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and dive into Genesis 15. I don't know if we'll finish, but we'll at least start in on it. And let's go ahead and look at these first few verses. So Genesis 15, I'm going to start with 1 through 6. Verse 1. After these things, suggesting, the getting Lot and everything, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision saying, do not fear, or fear not, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. And Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me, since I am childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. I bet you can't. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. All right, that's a good stopping point in our passage right now. So let's talk a little bit about this. As a broad division of chapter 15, these first 6 verses represent part 1, which is this conversation and promise yet again made from God to Abram. And then the second part of the chapter, verses 7 on through the end of the chapter of verse 21, is kind of the ceremonies of enacting this covenant between Abram and God. So let's explore these first 6 verses. Did anyone, again, read my mind, guess what I'm asking, right? Did anyone notice anything interesting about this exchange between God and Abram? Compare it to earlier.
For me.
Sorry?
Oh, I'm just kind of focusing on the same. I thought it was just kind of, again, wording and translations. But it was weird that, for me, what caught my attention was that it said that he believed in the Lord and not he believed the Lord. So, I don't know. With English, if I was doubting what God said to me, and I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm going to believe that. I believe the Lord, not in the Lord. And after it says that he believed the Lord, he was accounted it to him for righteousness. So was Noah, I don't know. I mean, was there salvation back then? Was he not saved? Was he, it's just kind of weird word.
Yeah, that is a good one. I'll unpack that in a moment. But I want to go back to like verses 1 and 2 first. So we'll get that before we finish tonight.
Okay.
Does anyone notice that Abram talks back to God? Notice we haven't done that yet. So up to this point, each time God is talking to Abram, calling him out of Haran, saying all these things are going to happen to you. Your children will be like the dust, and that's a good thing. Like Abram doesn't talk back. Here we finally get him to talk back. That's kind of interesting. This is the first real dialogue we seem to have. Previously, we only have monologues. Also note that the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Okay, so this is new. It's a theophany, perhaps. That is an appearance of God to humanity, which might explain the whole "don't be afraid," because that would be kind of scary if Abram's sitting there and poof, God, right? And not just like the startle effect, not the jump scare, but like God is God, and that's like different from a human, or at least that's what we're led to believe, right? Is that God is something fearful and would naturally cause fear. And so this is a common phrase when we get theophanies, is that God or angels who are representing God often start their phrase with "fear not." Right? They must be fairly awesome to behold, so to speak. So we get this "fear not," vision, theophany, and "fear not," and then dialogue. So does someone have a question there? I thought I saw a little bit of movement towards
I was just saying, like, I'd be scared if some rando dude was like popped in my room. He wouldn't have had to been mighty. It'd startle me.
Yeah. So it seems to suggest that it might be the startle effect, but it's also just the generalized nature, right? But notice how Abram goes immediately to, like, he seems to unpack, okay, the reward is great. He starts rich, he goes to Egypt, he gets richer, he goes and gets Lot, he gets richer still, he encounters Melchizedek, he might get richer still. And his response is, your reward will be great. Yeah, but I don't have any kids. And that's an interesting idea, that like all of this to Abram means, I don't want to say nothing, but certainly there's this factor that if he doesn't have somebody to leave it to, like a natural heir, something is wrong with this promise. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the way it should be, or like everyone should think in this way, but this is certainly the way Abram is conceptualizing what this promise entails. Like, if you're going to give me something, like, it's no good if it ends with me. And it would be much better if it was my biological progeny and not this Eliezer guy from Damascus. Okay, so what's that about? It looks like Eliezer is some sort of servant, perhaps the head of the household or something like this. But there is this idea that he could become the heir through what might be like an adoption process. And it would not be uncommon for an adult male to adopt another adult male so that they could become, quote, part of the family, so that they would have a way of transferring all their stuff or the important things onto another person that they had chosen. That, of course, is presuming they don't have a natural biological heir. We see this process of adoption in places like Newsy, which is like northeast, like kind of in the Syria area, more or less, right? And the response by God is like, no, your concern for a biological heir is going to be fulfilled. Like, you're worried about, like, are you going to have to do this weird adoption process? And I'm saying, no, what you want is a biological heir. You will get that. That is part and parcel of this promise that we have. And then he takes him outside and says, count the stars. That's how many your offspring will be. And then we get to this part that Reese brought up. Then he, Abram, believed in the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So what what does that mean? A lot of people want to interpret this as like the goodness and good qualities of Abram's character that suggests his belief in Yahweh was something deep inside him that made him worthy. Perhaps, but there are another way of rendering this. Nachum Sarna renders this. It reckoned it to his merit. So righteousness being merit, not like a quality of his character. That is, he like Abram chose to believe God's promise, and because of that, it warranted that made him worthy because he chose to believe him, and that made him worthy of all that God was giving him. So it's kind of, in Sarna's view, less about the quality of his character and more about the consequences of his actions to believe, Abram's actions to believe in God. Like, okay, I believe you. You believe me? That makes you worthy of getting all the stuff I'm giving you. Does that make sense? It's a subtle distinction. It may not be hugely important, but there is this idea of quality of the character versus the action of believing you as believing God is what warranted the reward. Reese, I saw you come off mute for a second. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, now you explained it, but I was like, did Abraham get a gold star or, but now I understand.
Yeah, he gets the gold star, the smiley face, and, you know, the big check mark on his term paper.
And since we're playing the pronoun game, there's no way, I don't know how to parse Hebrew, that these pronouns can be thrown around. I mean, we're talking about he believed and then he credited it to him. And so there's no alternate way of reading who he is in all of this and who's him and whose righteousness we're talking about.
Yeah, so let me take a moment to look back here, right? Back to verse 4, the subject is the word of the Lord came to him saying, so it's the implied subject of the Lord, even though technically the subject is right, the word of the Lord that's being
unpacked. And we are to assume that the word of the Lord is in the form of a person, like a human, like Megan was saying, that shows up, looks like a rando dude.
Right. It seems right. It's kind of not entirely clear. It seems that God shows up because
he could have come as an alpaca. That it didn't matter. I'd still be afraid.
Right. It seems to be a theophany, right? God showing up. But it is weird that it kind of disassociates that by the time we're in verse 4, right? Because I'll read the Hebrew in like literal English, right? And behold, the word of the Lord to him saying, like this one will not inherit or be the one who inherits from you, right? Because from out of your body will come the one that will be your heir. And he took him outside and he said, right, look, and this is interesting, look, please. God gets all polite here real quick. Look, please, heavenward, and count the stars if you are able to count them. And he said to him, thus will be your seed. Right? So clearly, in verse 5, God is the subject and the actor of all those verbs, right? Do this, do that, do the other, but all within direct speech. And we get to verse 6 and we have no particular reason to suggest, right? Well, it switches, right? And he believed in the Lord, because now in the Lord becomes the object, right? So therefore it must switch subjects, right? But he believed in the Lord, Now, somebody suggests that it switches back to God, and this is about a word order thing, right? And he reckoned him. That means it must switch back to God to reckon him, Abram, as righteous. That's a little. That's
so yeah. So it's not. Yeah, and that's where I'm just going. Where we're flipping back and forth in that one sentence. It would not be possible in that case for the one who's believing to be the one crediting the like what he received in this case the word as his righteousness of some sort.
Yeah. So I think the idea is right. Okay. So the beginning of verse 6, it looks like this. He believed in him it's in a different tense, not in the same narrative tense that is going before. Hebrew has this way of using verbs in a particular way that kind of goes, here's the narrative flow. And when it breaks that up, it's kind of like, for lack of a better term, background information or a parenthetical remark.
Right.
And so it switches from this, what are known as vayikdal verbs, which says, here's the narrative going along, into a perfect verb. So it's all you need to know is vayikdal says, okay, narrative, and a perfect verb goes, pause, here's some background information. And then it switches right back into the vayikdals, right? And so all those vayikdal verbs would suggest that then and he credited it to him is a vayikdal, which would then mean, let's go back to the subject of that whole series of vayikdals.
That makes sense.
Right. And the reason we have to take that perfect verb, the subject of that perfect verb as Abram, is because the object is God, right? So it's kind of like this, boom, parenthetical remark. He believed in him, back to the story. And therefore, God reckoned that as righteousness in Abraham. So that's a little technical. I didn't expect.
I know. I asked
to do that,
some
but that's
really
a great
dirty syntax stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's a little unclear, and I'll be honest. Like, I hadn't thought about that in particular, and I think it's only because, like, you get that series of verbs that might be clear to somebody who has read enough Hebrew to see that. But a native speaker would totally get that right on the face of it. All right. Good night, Megan Christian. All right. Well, I think that's a good stopping place. We will pick up at the end of chapter 15 next week. And we will continue with 16 and 17 as well next week. So we'll end 15, we'll jump into 16 and get to 17. And that's what will be our task for next week. We'll end it here, and hope you have a great week.